If you're looking to buy a stacked NBA 2K account with max badges and more, visit sportstmb.com. He has been in the community for years and has hundreds of reviews. Click the first link in the description to get your account today.
I became an NBA fan pretty late for someone who does what I do, which was roughly around 2013, when my dad convinced me to start watching some Bulls games, which I've got to say, screw you, Dad, for that. You couldn't have been a Warriors fan or something like that, because that really would have made me generally a lot more happy. That man cursed me to be a Bulls fan for life. But outside of the Bulls, the other reason that I fell in love with basketball was, as I've mentioned a million times, Kobe Bryant. I was watching Kobe mixes even before I watched NBA games, because I was a huge fan of playing basketball, just not watching it ever since I was like 8 years old. But the other thing that really got me into the NBA was my hatred of LeBron James and the Miami Heat, something else that I also inherited from my dad. I no longer hate LeBron James, but back then my bitter 13-year-old self sure as hell did. And with that hatred of the Miami Heat and LeBron James, there was one team that was consistently my second favorite team in the league during the start of my NBA fanhood, and that was the Indiana Pacers. The Pacers in 2013 and 2014 were one of the best teams in the NBA and one of the few legit threats to the Big Three Miami Heat. Led by a young budding superstar in Paul George, the Indiana Pacers, through some good defense and good team chemistry, nearly managed to take down the juggernaut team that was the Miami Heatles, losing in just 7 games in 2013 and 6 games in 2014. But after nearly overtaking the Big Three Heat as the biggest force in the Eastern Conference, this Pacers team fizzled out into obscurity, and eventually they had to move on from Paul George, trading him for Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis, and that move seems to have worked out for Indiana, but that team did have some serious potential and it ultimately went nowhere. So I wanted to reflect on this Pacers team and talk about what happened to them.
Absolutely incredibly with the acrobatic alley-oop.
Let's look at this Pacers roster and see why this team was so special. They only had like 5 key players, but luckily all 5 of those players played different positions, making for one of the best starting lineups in the league. George Hill, who this team unfortunately traded Kawhi Leonard for, was pretty much the definition of consistency for this team. He never stood out too much in the box score, putting up mid-teens in points and around 5 assists and 5 rebounds, but he was a steady and consistent offensive player who stretched the floor, could handle the ball, and create a little bit on offense, and more importantly, he was a very good defensive player, and with him being 6'4" and strong, he could defend both guard positions and sometimes even threes. George Hill was really valuable for this Pacers team. Unfortunately, they had to trade a guy who would eventually become a top 5 player in the league for him, but he was still very valuable for them. Small little anecdote about that trade, by the way. I dedicated a whole video to this topic a while ago, not about that Kawhi Leonard trade in any kind of what-if scenario, but rather the draft that happened the year prior. In the 2010 draft, the Pacers selected Tyler Hansbrough, or Psycho T as he was known, over Drew Holiday and Jeff Teague. The reason that the Pacers traded Kawhi Leonard was because they were in desperate need of a point guard who they got from the San Antonio Spurs, but if they had just drafted Drew Holiday or Jeff Teague a year prior, they would have never had that issue, and in turn, they never would have had to trade Kawhi Leonard. And they could have had a core of Drew, Paul George, and Kawhi, which would have not only been better than those 2013-14 Pacers teams, but also probably would have been way more long-lasting. So drafting Tyler Hansbrough ended up being the biggest mistake for the Pacers rather than just trading Kawhi. If they had just drafted Drew Holiday, they probably would have won a championship by now. Anyways, The next guy that we gotta talk about is a bit of a character, and by bit of a character, I mean he blew in LeBron James's ears in the playoffs, and he also beat his girlfriend. That second one isn't quite as fun, but it should be mentioned, and I feel gets overlooked with Lance Stephenson way too much. Lance Will Make Him Dance is really fun until you remember that he's a domestic abuser. But moving past that, Lance was really the other rising star for this Pacers team. He only averaged 8 points per game in 2013, but in the following year he put up 14 points per game, shooting 49% from the field and 35% from three, while averaging 7 rebounds and 5 assists. But most importantly with Lance, the guy was just a pest and a phenomenal defensive player. His game was similar to that of Marcus Smart. He was a hustle guy who would put it all on the line defensively and sometimes make questionable plays offensively, but he was ultimately a positive and a winning player. Then we have David West, who was in his 30s, a vet who was hard-nosed and a no bullshit type of guy. He was a very talented scorer in the post, in the pick and roll, and as a mid-range shooter. He also was a good rebounder and an underrated playmaker, averaging 3 assists per game for the Pacers. But again, the most notable factor with David West was his defense, and you're probably noticing a theme with this Pacers team. David was a solid interior defender and just a really tough dude. He was the type of guy who'd rather throw a guy on the floor than give him a layup. Then for the next big man on this team, we have Roy Hibbert, who was incredibly memed on, deservingly so, but from 2012 to 2014, he was a really good player for them. He was a great rim protector, putting up 2.5 blocks in 2013 and 2.2 a game in 2014. He was also a solid rebounder and rim running big man, getting around 11 points per game. He was also rewarded possibly the most bullshit all-star selection ever in 2014. In a season where he averaged 11 points, 2 blocks, and 6.6 rebounds, shooting just 44% as a big man. Just because he was associated with a decent team, I guess he was given a participation trophy. I have no idea why. Anyways, once again, great defensive player. Hibbert even got this iconic block on Carmelo Anthony in the playoffs that essentially ended the Knicks being a respectable basketball team for the next 6 years and probably the next 10 plus if we're being realistic. But of course, as I said in the intro, there was no player on this roster more important than Paul George. There was actually a pretty awkward thing going on with this Pacers team in 2013, and that was the Danny Granger situation. From 2008 to 2012, Granger was a 20-plus point per game scorer for Indiana, but after sustaining a major injury that essentially ended his career at the start of the 2012-13 season, that's when the Pacers started blossoming and Paul George was unleashed. After averaging just 12 points per game in 2012, in 2013, given a bigger role offensively, he got up to 17 points per game, and then in the following year, he was putting up 22 points per game. And I've said this with everyone else on this team to this point, and it still applies to Paul George. Despite being a very good offensive player, he was even more impressive defensively, being one of the best perimeter defenders in the league and consistently going toe-to-toe with LeBron James and getting some stops. This team had a defensive identity. They were first in defensive rating in 2013 and 2014, and with that defense, they were able to be one of the best teams in the league, winning 49 games and getting the 3rd seed in the Eastern Conference in 2013, and then making the 1st seed the following year with 56 wins. And now I guess would be a good time to mention their matchups versus the Miami Heat, because that is what they are notorious for. The Indiana Pacers were not taken all too seriously going into the 2013 playoffs. The Big Three Miami Heat were clearly the top dogs, and then after that, the Knicks had a superstar in Carmelo Anthony, and they played some great regular season ball, so they were seen as a better team. But this Pacers team, after actually pretty narrowly squeaking by the Hawks in 6 games, they beat that Knicks team in 6 as well to end up in the conference finals, where they pushed the Heat to 7 games. A team that hadn't even won 50 games pushed the Big Three Heat to a 7-game series. And actually, weirdly enough, Roy Hibbert was the best player in that series for the Pacers, averaging 22 and 10. But Paul George, who was the one who looked like a young superstar on this Pacers team, hitting many big shots and going right at LeBron James with an extreme level of confidence. And then in 2014, when the Pacers were a better team with more expectations and the Miami Heat were a worse team, somehow they only went to 6 games this time, including a blowout in Game 6. This time, Paul George stepped up, averaging 24 points per game for the series, and once again he was going at LeBron James, but everyone else just did not play as well. And that is pretty much the answer to the mystery of why this Pacers team fell off. 3 of the 5 guys just stopped playing as well as they had in their starting lineup. David West was excusable because he was in his mid-30s, but Roy Hibbert and Lance Stevenson were both in their 20s, and yet Roy Hibbert went from Defensive Player of the Year level and solid offensive player to okay defensive player and bad offensive player, consistently having games with multiple zeros in the box score. Lance ended up letting all those flashes of a star career and people praising him go to his head, so he ended up leaving in free agency to try and prove himself as a star player, getting a pretty contract from the Charlotte Hornets with the hope of him being the second star next to Kemba Walker, but that certainly did not work out as he averaged 8 points per game on 37% shooting, and then he was shopped around the league for a while, and he currently is not in the league. Not that I feel sorry for him. And then the biggest and most obvious thing was Paul George having a horrific injury that never even should have happened. In a scrimmage for Team USA, the base of the goal was 2 feet closer than it is in the NBA, and it led to Paul George bending his leg to a 45-degree angle when he attempted to go for a chase down block on James Harden. It was an injury that I had the misfortune of viewing live. But that did not have to be the end of this Pacers team, it was just the exclamation point on the end of a very weird decline for many of their players. There were some internal issues and drama, all of which is pretty hazy and I don't feel like going into, but ultimately the downfall of this team was their guys just started sucking. This Pacers team just kind of stopped playing well, and that's really disappointing because they had the potential to be a championship level team. But that's the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and cue the outro music.